My name is Ivana Hughes. I'm the president of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the new president as of August 1st. I'm very excited to be in this role. I am also a senior lecturer at Columbia University, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome all of you to a continuation of our series on nuclear dangers. We actually started this series back in March of this year, just after the Ukraine war had begun, and really recognized that there was just both an urgency to the current moment as well as an outpouring of interest in hearing about these issues. And I was actually, this was around the time that I had just begun to speak with people at the organization, and I did attend all three events and just thought that they were absolutely fabulous. So we really wanted to be able to continue this. And I'm absolutely delighted that today you'll be hearing from Richard Falk, who was of course part of the entire series. He actually, along with people like Cynthia Lazaroff and Noam Chomsky and Daniel Ellsberg and former governor of California, Jerry Brown, really delved into these issues. And I think all of the events were fantastic. So we're looking forward to continuing this throughout the fall. The inspiration for today's event was actually specifically an honor that was bestowed on one of Richard's books. And it was actually one of, I don't know if it was his first, was it your first book, Richard? Or was one of your early books? One of your early books. It's the book, This Endangered Planet, Prospects and Proposals for Human Survival. It came out, it was published in 1971. And just in the last month, the Council for Foreign Affairs, which publishes the Council on Foreign Relations, I apologize, which publishes the Foreign Affairs magazine, is celebrating its 100th anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the magazine. And for the centennial issue, their reviewers chose 6 books that are essential for understanding the century. And in fact, Richard's book, This Endangered Planet, is considered one of 3 essential for understanding the century ahead. And I should just stress that this is a book essential for understanding the century ahead, but it was written over 50 years ago. I should also say that among the 6 authors of the 6 books selected, Richard is actually the only living author. So this is really an amazing opportunity to actually speak with one of the people who have been honored in this way. So today, I know nuclear dangers in the Ukraine war are on all of our minds, but we're gonna try to go just a little bit broader as well. We will begin by thinking about the current moment, but we're going to try to dig a little deeper and consider some of the other global challenges as well. And of course, the way in which nuclear dangers, nuclear weapons and nuclear dangers more generally intersect with these other challenges. So now that I said all of that, I'm actually now going to introduce Richard. And I'm going to just begin my introduction by saying that when I was first in touch with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation board and the wonderful Sandy Jones, who's here behind the scenes organizing everything, she had told me that I would meet with a group of people, and she said who they were, and Richard was on the list. And I remember just how anxious I was to meet someone like Richard Falk. What could I possibly, how could I handle this? And Richard was, from the very first moment that he showed up, it was a Zoom meeting, that he showed up on the screen, just the most welcoming, supportive, wonderful person that just put me at ease immediately and made me feel like a part of NAPF right away. And that has certainly been the theme of our interactions ever since. So I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce him to you today. Richard is actually at NAPF. He's our senior vice president. But of course, he's had many titles throughout his long and incredible career. He was a professor of international politics at Princeton for 40 years. And there he was active in seeking an end to the Vietnam War, a better understanding of Iran, a just solution for Israel and Palestine, and improved democracy elsewhere. He also served as the UN Special Rapporteur for occupied Palestine. And in 2010, he was named Outstanding Public Scholar in Political Economy by the International Studies Association. Since 2009, he has been nominated annually for the Nobel Prize. And I'll just say that I just finished reading this. I guess this is mirror imaged for you, but I just finished reading this Endangered Planet. But the next book on my nightstand is The Public Intellectual. So this is The Life of a Citizen Pilgrim, Richard's memoir, which came out last year. And I can tell you that just by glancing through, I'm so excited to read the book and gain further insight from Richard. So I'll stop there with the introduction and just welcome Richard. Allow him to say a few words, and then we'll get started with our discussion.
Well, thank you so much, Ivana, for that incredibly gracious introduction. And I would only say that the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is extraordinarily fortunate to have you as our new president. I think it will make a huge difference in going forward at this time when nuclear dangers have become more salient than any time, at least in this century. And we have an opportunity, I think, to highlight those dangers in a way that looks toward a post-nuclear world. And I think that's what we really are seeking, some way of getting rid of these infernal weapons, and in the process, raising questions about militarism and war in general. And because in the end, it will be necessary to think beyond nuclear weapons themselves, so as not to create a situation that the world is rid of nuclear weapons in order to make it safe for large-scale conventional war. That would be a kind of perverse tragedy that we all must keep in our mind as we focus on nuclear issues. But I know you have questions for us to talk about, so
yes,
let me
yes,
stop
absolutely.
there.
And I'll just say to what you just said that it's interesting to me, and we'll come back to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Article 6 later on, but it's very interesting that Article 6, which obliges nuclear weapon states to negotiate in good faith towards nuclear disarmament, also obliges them to do so towards general disarmament, right? And that's precisely what you're saying, is that these two things must in fact be linked, and we'll get there. We'll get to those obligations. But let me just for everyone's sake, since the last nuclear dangers conversation was with former Governor Brown, and that was in May. Let me just ask you where you think we are with respect to the war. It's clearly ongoing. Clearly, no sort of progress has been made in terms of getting to peace negotiations, peaceful agreement. Where do you think things are at the moment, and how would you describe kind of, are things where you would have thought they would be by this time back in May, or has anything changed?
I'm afraid it has changed, and and from my point of view, for the worse. In May, it was possible to imagine a diplomatic compromise that would allow Ukraine to survive as a sovereign state, more or less territorially intact, and make some concessions in the eastern part of the country that would protect the so-called Russian-oriented minority. And I was disappointed then, and it was a theme in the discussion with Governor Brown, that the US showed no diplomatic interest in doing something to at least create a sense that diplomacy was an alternative. It might not have been a successful alternative. We know very little about how Putin might have interacted with such a diplomatic initiative. But at that time, the US government focused on demonizing Putin and encouraging through weaponry and diplomatic rhetoric for the Ukrainians to inflict a kind of strategic defeat on Russia. And even if that meant prolonging the war. And my emphasis at that time was on the fact that the Russians, no doubt, although with provocation, initiated a war of aggression against Ukraine. But we being the United States, responded to that in an irresponsible fashion by initiating our own geopolitical war, where we thought we had the option of inflicting a defeat on Russia that would also serve as a warning to China and solidify the US position as the only source of global security since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. And so what was at stake in this geopolitical war was what's been called by some a unipolar world, or put more polemically, a Monroe Doctrine for the entire world, where only the United States could act militarily beyond its borders and do so with a certain sense of legitimacy. But now we're in a situation where the Ukrainians, having been armed and having been agitated to seek a victory, not a diplomatic resolution, have backed the Russians into not only a defeat, but a situation where Putin's rule is at stake, or at least there seems to be the sense that he must come away with some showing of at least avoiding defeat. And the only way he clearly has to do that is by threatening to introduce tactical nuclear weapons. A horrible tactic, but a tactic that political leaders do for rather unconvincing reasons. We shouldn't be too, what shall I say, too arrogant about our own behavior. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, everybody but the Kennedys wanted to teach the Soviet Union a lesson by initiating nuclear war against their ships carrying nuclear weapons. And it was only, as the most reputable scholars have shown us, it was only what some call dumb luck that prevented stumbling into a nuclear war, plus the awareness of the Kennedy brothers that this was not a rational way of preserving either global security or American national interest.
Wonderful, Richard. Thank you so much for that kind of introduction into the topic. I just overall, while I was reading your book, I just kept being shocked really over and over again, both just how prophetic your words were on so many issues and topics, but also just how much of what you discussed, it really truly applies to the current moment. And so in the book, there's a chapter, early chapter, entitled Underlying Causes of Planetary Danger. And there you talk about the scale of statehood and the way in which large states present a kind of threat to the planet in the way that small states, regardless of how autocratic their leaders are or how perhaps abusive they may be towards their own citizens, they don't present that same kind of a planetary threat. And I quote here where you propose that large states adhere, and here's the part that's a quote, to a simplistic ideology that explains away problems as combat between forces of good and evil. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that sort of general view, and in the context of the current war, both in terms of what the U.S. and its allies, I was at the UN for much of August and even some during the General Assembly. I mean, unprovoked and illegitimate, sort of the same narrative comes over and over and over again. And of course from Russia too, right? They have their own narrative. So this kind of just dichotomy of good versus evil, and that's really it. That's any explanation we ever really get. So anyway, let me let you comment on this.
Yes, I think, Ivana, it's a very fundamental dimension of these international confrontations, that both sides deliberately engage in a very powerful campaign of state propaganda. And both sides have compliant mainstream media. It's more obvious in the Russian case, but it's equally pernicious, in my view, in our case, that we don't see the complexity of issues of international conflict. We don't take into account our own contribution to the escalation of the conflict. And there's no doubt, as George Kennan and others warned the West, that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it would be a huge mistake to encourage any eastward movement and further expansion of NATO. That Russia would be acutely sensitive to that. And yet, our bipartisan foreign policy elite deliberately, in the decade before the invasion, did a lot of provocative things. They don't add up to a justification for the aggression, but they do show a kind of geopolitical irresponsibility. And in a certain way, we should recognize that the UN after World War II was set up with a certain level of deference to this geopolitical irresponsibility. That's one way of understanding why the 5 most dangerous countries in the world were given a right of exception in the form of a veto. In other words, they, in a technical legal sense, Russia cannot be held by a decision of the Security Council to have violated the Charter because it has the right of veto. And this was deliberately designed as part of a realistic way of avoiding the mistakes made prior to World War II during the League of Nations period, when there was no account taken of the way in which these so-called great powers behaved, and they left the organization, or they never joined it, as was the case with the US, or they were expelled, as was the case with Germany. So the decision was made that it would be better to have these dangerous large-scale nation states within the framework of the UN than to have them outside of it. But a high cost has been paid for that. And it's very difficult to know whether this is, on balance, a survivable Faustian bargain, so to speak. It presupposes a level of responsibility and self-restraint by these geopolitical actors that they have consistently not shown, not demonstrated, for the reasons you suggest, that their perception of reality is, and their need to mobilize the citizenry behind their foreign policy produces a polarization of outlook. And that polarization is given a moral edge of being good. Each side portrays itself as good and its adversary as evil. The US is sustained further by its so-called American exceptionalism, that we're not like other countries. We're sort of inscribed in our political genes is a kind of permanent innocence, and that transcends any behavior that contradicts it. We all know that genetics is more important than experience in shaping our behavior. So it's a very unfortunate situation for which there is no immediate institutional cure. And we see no willingness on the part of these large-scale countries, some of which deserve under these considerations to have the right of veto, like India or Brazil. And so the UN is both anachronistic and in a certain way, from an international law perspective, regressive. And so solve problems like Ukraine against that background is not easy, and it's made highly dangerous by this situation of backing Putin and Russia into a corner where their alternatives are surrender or recourse to nuclear weapons.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
that
no,
didn't exist back in May.
yeah, absolutely. Where do you see China in this picture? Right, because they're,
Well, China has, from an early stage, been, I think, an equal target in the what I was calling it the geopolitical war. In other words, Russia was the immediate target, but China, as the more feared competitor and rival, was seen as the principal target in a way. And the message that was that was sent to China, or the desire was to send a message to China that they would confront what Russia was confronting, only much more in a much more robust form, if they dared to seek to control Taiwan through the use of force.
yeah, no, thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about nuclear weapons. And again, I keep coming back to just how much of what you wrote over 50 years ago is still relevant. But you, when you wrote the book, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty had just gone into force a year earlier. And you were immediately a critic of the focus on non-proliferation. And I quote, representing an effort by the nuclear superpowers to deny additional states the prospect of becoming significant challengers of their dominance on the world scene. Why otherwise concentrate on non-proliferation rather than on the renunciation of the right to use nuclear weapons or even of their elimination? I mean, we're still 50 years later. This is still precisely the same conversation that we're having. The 10th NPT review conference just ended without an outcome document. Some people were very disappointed that the document that had been in circulation hadn't been adopted, but I just thought so little of the document that I was sort of almost relieved that it wasn't adopted. And of course, that was the second review conference in a row that had failed to produce an outcome document. And in between, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons had actually been negotiated and even entered into force. So maybe we can talk a little bit about the context of nuclear superpowers really holding on to these weapons as perhaps a way of holding on to power and just not being willing to give up on the status quo.
Yes, I think that's really the fundamental reason why nuclear weapons are still in the arsenals of the most important countries in the world. And you sort of praise my book for being prophetic, but in a way I don't deserve that. What really is the case is that the world hasn't changed. See, that the structures that were latent in 50 years ago have become more salient, more visible, and of course they have been given a kind of an apocalyptic dimension through climate change and now through the renewal of direct confrontation between the two most powerful nuclear states. So the reason that I felt I was appalled, for instance, that the treaty itself wasn't called the Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Disarmament Treaty. See, the West particularly, and I would guess the Soviet Union alongside it, they liked this idea of a bipolar world that they managed. And a lot of what we talked about in the last question was who's going to manage geopolitics? The UN is too weak so to do it. It doesn't have the capabilities or the trust of or the funding. It can't do it. So if there's to be any management of geopolitics, it has to be under the leadership of the most dominant states. They're the most important political actors in the world. And that has meant that psychologically, they are reluctant to renounce the use and possession of the most powerful weapon. And they think that that the best way of maintaining peace is by threatening others with the catastrophic consequences of challenging in any fundamental way their hegemonic role. And that, in a sense, it brings us back to Ukraine, because what we're doing in Ukraine at this point is seeming to challenge Russia's entitlement to be one of those hegemonic actors. And therefore the stakes are very high. And I'm not sure that those who are devising the policy are either prudent enough or capable of grasping what a systemic catastrophe it would be if that policy doesn't result in Putin's downfall, but in a major recourse to nuclear weaponry. And I think that's the dilemma I see at the moment.
Yeah, and I'll just add, Richard, there that even just in my short time of kind of, as you know, of course, my entry into nuclear weapons issues was really more through research and teaching. And so entering kind of that diplomatic scene and international relations and seeing what goes on at the UN, I mean, I've been just so inspired and impressed by the efforts of the countries from the global south, of course, with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons being such a major achievement. But in all of this, one of the things that I find is that even people who really think and work on these issues really don't deeply understand just how big of a danger a nuclear war in this day and age would be. I think many people Imagine something on the scale of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, maybe a little bigger, but that's kind of where, they recognized that that was horrible and horrifying and devastating, which it of course was. But nuclear war today would be nothing like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be like child's play as opposed to actual adult war. And it truly threatens all of life on the planet, and it truly threatens humanity as we know it. And so to me, these, again, when we go back to those simplistic narratives of, you got to stop Putin no matter what the cost is, to me, it just, no, humanity's existence is not worth putting in jeopardy under these circumstances. Countries, I mean, Anthony Blinken during the NPT review conference said that the United States, this is my emphasis, would only use nuclear weapons under extreme circumstances. That's just unacceptable. Russia's saying it would only use nuclear weapons if the state is threatened. That's just unacceptable. I mean, these are simply unacceptable. To me, no state, no territory, should come ahead of the existence of humanity. And so, the question really is how to, it almost seems like these, right, the 5 nuclear weapon states, the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states, and primary, of course, United States and Russia, because they have so many weapons, because they truly could put all of humanity at risk of existence. It seems like this is the one thing they actually do agree on. It's for all of them to keep those nuclear weapons, right? They disagree on many things, but this is, holding on to the weapons seems to be a major part of what they actually agree on. And I guess the question to me, the question from me to you is, if Article 6 obliges them, towards to move towards nuclear disarmament, what can we do? What are the besides obviously, in fact, having a treaty that makes nuclear weapons illegal? Like, how do we get there? How do we kind of push that obligation forward?
I think it's very hard to give a convincing answer at this stage, because all the paths to that sort of future seem blocked. And starting with the understanding that you report upon, that many of the people that you encountered in the UN context don't seem to appreciate the depth of and scale of the dangers of a nuclear war. That kind of ignorance is inexcusable. At the same time, it's explicable, because if they did understand it, they couldn't keep their jobs. See, and they want a place at the table. And if you want to be at the table, you have to accept the mythology of non-proliferation. You have to accept the idea that deterrence has been, on balance, successful and responsible for keeping the peace during the Cold War, and that it is necessary, the best security is to keep ahead of the game. In other words, to keep developing better and better weaponry, which will be more and more intimidating to any challenger, and the challenger has the same incentives to play the game better. And that's what, of course, an arms race consists of. So we're really in a self-destructive trap that I don't have the political imagination to find the exit strategy.
Right.
I mean, it seems like we can't expect much until, and maybe the treaty for the prevention of nuclear weapon, the treaty of prohibition of nuclear weapons is a first step. That the global South and others really confront the nuclear power, and they're supported by, which I think would happen, a global solidarity movement of civil society. It's only through that kind of movement from below and above that has any prospect of challenging the militarism and nuclearism that prevails. And one thing that, let me just throw it out as an idea, is that people should begin talking about the Non-Proliferation Treaty having been materially breached by the failure over this more than half a century to implement it in good faith. A failure that has been called unlawful by the huge majority of the judges of the International Court of Justice. And it may be time for the presentation to the court again for an advisory opinion to say whether the treaty is still valid in view of the Article 6, the failure to implement Article 6. And we should remember that Article 6 is not only pledging nuclear disarmament, it pledges also general and complete disarmament. It was a commitment, a legal commitment to, in a sense, demilitarize geopolitics. And that's what we have to, as peace-oriented people, I think that's what we have to start demanding and not be shy.
Yeah, yeah. Are there, Richard, this is me speaking as a scientist and really lacking sort of the background on international law, but are there other examples? I mean, clearly countries can leave treaties when they're no longer, as for example, North Korea did, right? When they no longer want to, in fact, comply with the treaty's obligations. But in this case, we have these 5 states remaining in the treaty, supporting the treaty, you know, always talking about it as the cornerstone of international security, and in fact not complying. Are there any other examples where this has happened?
I can't think of any offhand. Of course, in Article 10,
right, they're allowed to leave, right?
Yes, they have a right of withdrawal, and whether that right would be respected, there've been intimations that Iran can't withdraw, even though it's quite legitimately under threat. And one should understand that in addition to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, there's a non-proliferation regime that is managed by the U.S., presided over by the U.S., and takes it upon itself to selectively enforce the obligation not to acquire nuclear weapons. Eyes were closed when Israel acquired nuclear weapons in a stealth manner that is what Iran is being accused of doing. And so it's not only that there's a kind of flawed treaty, but there's a selective regime of enforcement of that treaty.
Right.
And so you have a very unusual situation in international law as a result.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll just say, putting many other issues aside, and obviously we see there are big news coming out of Iran at the moment with the protests and so on. But putting those issues aside, I have to say that being at the UN and listening to Iran's statements on nuclear weapons versus the United States statements on nuclear weapons, one is clearly preferable than the other. And I'll just leave it at that. I mean, to me, it sort of feels shocking that we are, we call ourselves the leaders of the free world, and yet we are, our sort of track record on all of this is absolutely abysmal. I will offer one kind of thought that in terms of perhaps a pessimistic view on what could be done with nuclear weapons. I really do think that we need to kind of have a culture shift again, where this is an issue that people are hearing about, reading about. Now we sort of read about it in almost a normalized way, like, oh, Putin threatens and here's what the US might do. I mean, it's sort of shocking that that's the way it's being presented in the media. But I think it needs to be much more a part of the culture. There should be films about this. There should be, I even have this idea, someone should make a TV show about the UN. It would make a great TV show of the, all that's going on and all the different issues people are working on. And but in terms of this, cultural impact, at one of the events that I participated in August, actually, it was brought up. It was Zia Mian from Princeton, and a couple of other people were talking about this, that what happens with civil society in the United States actually really matters even to leaders that they're paying attention, even autocratic leaders in places like Russia, China, and elsewhere are paying attention to what US civil society is doing and whether this is an issue for US civil society. So just sort of stressing that we have a role to play. At the very least, we're free to say these things, right? As opposed to citizens in places where that may not be the case. And so we really have a role to play in shifting that opinion towards just making it very clear that the existence of nuclear weapons is unacceptable. Richard, let me go back to a few things and just broaden the discussion a little bit. A few things from the book. So in the book, you discuss 4 dimensions of planetary dangers. So I know you don't have the book, so our audience should know Richard is in Turkey and doesn't actually have a copy of his book. So if he doesn't understand, if he doesn't remember everything he wrote over 50 years ago, I think that's okay. But I'll remind you. You talk about 4 dimensions: war system, number 1, population pressure, number 2, the insufficiency of resources, number 3, and environmental overload, number 4. And I'll just ask, maybe you don't have to comment on all of them, but even 1 or 2, and just the way in which you see these dimensions as having changed, remained the same, whether your fears back then have kind of evolved as you've learned more over time, as we've all learned more over time. Just any comments on that would be great.
As far as I can say without further thought, is that the 4 dimensions seem to me to hold up fairly well, but I would reformulate them a little bit. I mean, instead of environmental protection, I would talk about ecological habitability. and instead of population as such, the um, the carrying capacity of the planet as and made more complex and difficult, the more people there are and the higher the living standards of those people are, and that we could have a more enjoyable life on the planet with a smaller total population. And again, with resource depletion, I think I would emphasize energy geopolitics to a greater extent, and talk less about depletion than the dysfunctional use of the resources of the planet, and try to understand it in that way. But I would still think that these four dimensions, the interplay, is vital for grasping the complexity and originality of the time we're living in. Because in prior periods, civilizations collapsed and large states collapsed, but the planet as a whole was not endangered. It was the scale of disruption affected parts, sometimes large parts, but not the whole. And so we're now in a civilizational or planetary mode in which our technology and our behavior are affecting the whole, and yet we don't have the outlook, either the mental outlook or the institutional infrastructure to deal with the whole. It's still a state-centric world, a world of fragments, not a holistic world. And and how one deals with problems of the whole when the structure is one of the dominance of the parts, what systems theorists call subsystem dominance. And I think that trying to think along those lines at least helps us understand the uniqueness of this challenge if it's formulated in world order terms. That it's not enough to make peace between the parts. We have to find ways to strengthen the whole, a holistic conception of the management of power and authority and problem solving.
Yeah, and when it comes to that kind of holistic thinking, I think at the time that you published your book, global warming obviously wasn't a widely recognized problem. Actually, from the perspective of sort of scientific history, we knew back in the 19th century that we have greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, that they trap heat by virtue of their sort of chemical behavior. And then we later learned that burning fossil fuels would actually put out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, but it wasn't clear whether that effect would actually be appreciable, whether it would in fact change the temperature. And it was, I would say that from the perspective of really looking at data and really making conclusions based on evidence. Probably one of the first papers was actually from Columbia's Wally Broecker, who even coined the term global warming in 1975. So this was, the same decade that you were already concerned about this endangered planet. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about global warming. You did say at one point in the book, actually page 430, you wrote, you even mentioned rising temperatures. And you mentioned, and I have no idea how you knew that, but somehow you did, and major radioactive leakages, potential 21st century problems. And of course, we encountered both squarely in the 20th century, and are continuing to sort of deal with them. But in terms of global warming, maybe we can talk a little bit about sort of where you are in terms of thinking about this, whether you see it connected to nuclear dangers and nuclear weapons, how you're thinking. In many ways, it really falls under your environmental overload dimension, but also insufficiency of resources. If we're going to keep using energy the way we do, it's also a resource problem.
Yes, I think it's, again, very daunting to know how one can, given the way the world is structured, how we can move toward some kind of realistic solution-oriented strategy, which I think we all want to do. I'm reminded of the Gorbachev period early period in the Soviet Union, where a friend of mine talked about Gorbachev having given the Russian people glasnost, but not perestroika. And by that he meant glasnost meant free expression. You knew you were able to say everything, and perestroika was supposed to be restructuring.
Right.
And I think that was a kind of his personal tragedy, that he couldn't manage internally perestroika for a variety of reasons that were not fundamentally his fault. And so we're at that kind of perestroika moment where we know what's wrong and we know what to do, but we don't know how to get it done.
Right.
And Shakespeare and other literary figures have often confronted characters in fiction who knew what they should be doing, but they didn't know how to do it. And I'm afraid the species is in that situation. And we have a notable vacuum of attentive leadership that is sensitive to the agenda of imperative issues that we've been trying to discuss.
Yeah, and how much is that? I'm looking through some of my notes because I know I had this was also a quote that I had jotted down, where you discussed the way in which those national governments simply aren't necessarily interested in solving these holistic global solutions because they're afraid, in fact, that they're going to lose support. And this is a quote from you, in the arena of internal politics, that in fact, it would be political suicide to truly be addressing these larger humanity driven issues. And I then wrote down Gorbachev ? Kennedy ? I mean, it just sort of, how much of that nation state imposing its own, and we as citizens actually in a way encouraging that, right? So if we all were sort of asking for something different, maybe they'd give us something different, right? Is it an impossible feedback loop to get out of?
Well, the sort of obvious difficulty is that the performance of political elites is judged in short-term cycles. And that's true for corporate elites too. They have very little to gain by uh, taking what are wise and prudent long-term strategies, because they're judged, whether they're in autocracies or in democracies, by what they get done in 4 to 10 years. And autocracies can suppress opposition and criticism, but they're essentially, the political cycles are dominated by this kind of short-termism. And we're in an era that some have called the Anthropocene era, where all these problems solve the salient and most urgent problems require long-term thinking, long-term approaches. And so how do we bridge that gap is one thing. The other thing is that I would mention is you can't gain access to the existing political elites unless they feel comfortable that you share their basic assumptions. Dissent is not welcome in Washington, in the inner circles of Washington.
Yeah.
And therefore you don't get creative friction within elite circles, even in democracy, even in the most sophisticated democracies. And so we're up against a real perestroika problems of how do we get out of that kind of vicious circle of reproducing that which we're trying to get rid of.
No, this notion that we're, somehow free to say all of these things, but we won't really push the needle in that direction, is that can also feel really depressing and unsettling. Let me actually, since we are about 25 minutes from the end, and I'd like to definitely open it up for questions. I did want to try to end on a promising note, and perhaps ask about where we might be able to find some encouragement. In your last chapter in the book, you have 2 images of the future. And one image is starkly dark and the other is bright and optimistic. And you referred to the possibility of the 21st century being the century of world harmony. Clearly, we're not there. But the question is there hope that we could? Is there hope that the 22nd century could be the century of world harmony? And if we are to get to a better place, what would happen? What would have to happen in the next 10, 20, 30 years? What would that timeline have to look like?
That's a huge question, I would say. The first thing, I think there's no way of projecting future trends convincingly in an optimistic mode at the present time. And that's led me to feel that the most constructive way of trying to fashion some hope in the future is to talk about and analyze what I call the politics of impossibility. And we've all lived through a period where the impossible has happened quite frequently. The collapse of apartheid in South Africa without a bloody war, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, all of those things were not predicted by almost every expert, or they were. And I remember being in South Africa, for instance, 10 years before Mandela was released from prison, and being told that any transformation of apartheid society except through a bloody war was pure utopian thinking.
Right.
And that came from the Africans, and it came from the Afrikaners, and it came from the English liberals as well. There was that. In other words, we should be content with our inability to anticipate the future, which isn't altogether a bad thing. I mean, but it will take what I've also called a necessary utopia to liberate the world from its present dilemmas and tendencies toward catastrophe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When I was in Vienna in June for the first meeting of states parties for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, that treaty notably doesn't have anything about timelines either. It is now looking towards putting timelines for if, let's say, a country joins the treaty that already has nuclear weapons, what's the timeline for them to get rid of nuclear weapons? And they're trying to set that up in a way that makes sense, given how quickly nuclear weapon states have in fact been replacing, right? They don't have the same weapons they did when they first acquired them. But at that time, I was trying to think about whether it made sense to propose some sort of a timeline, and propose perhaps 2045, which would be the 100th anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing, of the formation, the founding of the UN, and so on and so forth. And a number of people just sort of reacted like, well, that's too far in the future, one, and two, you just can't predict, like things could happen in a sort of more sudden way, the way the Berlin Wall fell, or as you described, the way that things changed so dramatically in South Africa. By the way, South Africa gives some of the best statements on nuclear disarmament as far as I'm concerned. They're absolutely incredible and inspiring. So I see Rich Applebaum first, and then we'll go to Phoebe Knopf.
Right, thank you, Richard and Ivana. There are a lot of people on this call who have a lot of experience. I see Tom Plate, Dan Ellsberg, among others. What should we be doing? How the people who have been listening to this, or to be more specific, what might the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation do now to make a difference?
Richard, I'm going to have you take the questions.
I think it's more your thought.
Well, why don't you give it a try, and then I'll comment as well. How about that?
Well, I think essentially make an effort to create a sufficient funding base so that we can reach effectively young people throughout the country. I think the hope is with youth, and that if we can let young people understand that if they want to inherit a livable world, they need to be active beyond their own personal horizons of career and private life, and that it's an urgency. It's a period of urgency, and I think we're Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, given Ivana's energetic leadership, is in a position to really do that. But it should be done on a big scale.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think to me, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in particular really offers hope, because it offers a very clear pathway. But I agree with Richard that engaging young people and perhaps also just broadening our base a little bit in making connections to those other planetary challenges, including climate change. I think those two are, to me, really key towards success. But in terms of kind of day to day, I think there is a big difference right now. The Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has been ratified by 68 countries, and 94, I believe, have signed. And, you know, I think there's a big difference if you had over 100 ratifications and you know, well over 100 signatories. I think that would really, we sort of have to keep bringing that number up and up and up. I think that's definitely an important step towards all of this. All right, let's go to Phoebe. I apologize, Phoebe Knopf. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you know, if there's any group effort anywhere in the world to try to look at the problem of nuclear weapons through the lens of psychology. I'm not a psychologist, but I just wonder if there's a way with compassion and humility and all the intelligence and imagination we can muster to kind of kindle conversations about the need for all of us really in this wonderful but somewhat dysfunctional global human family to look at our aggression and the way we sometimes project aggression toward others because we can't face our wounds. And I wonder if we could have a conversation with humility and respect about that aspect.
Richard, do you want to take
well, I can only say amen to that. I mean, I think there's no question that that would be an illuminating thing to do. I mean, it's been attempted. Years ago, I wrote a book with Robert J. Lifton, who's a well-known psychiatrist, on the title of the book was Indefensible Weapons, a Psychological and Political something. I forget the whole subtitle, but there has been efforts all along to see these issues through that kind of lens. And I think it's extremely important what Ivana raised about the polarization of perception is one of the things that keeps us locked into these dangerous confrontational ways of thinking, acting, and feeling. And we need some kind of psychological liberation from that retrograde way of understanding reality.
Thank you.
Let's go to Judy Blakey.
Wonderful to hear the comments about South Africa because I'm a South African migrant, anti-apartheid protester who was traumatized by police, and we ended up migrating to New Zealand. So I'm really, really interested because I was in New Zealand. I participated and I was a research officer for the New Zealand Nuclear Test Veterans Study, which has been discredited for a whole variety of reasons. But we looked at the psychological impact of exposure, observing those, the Operation Grapple around Christmas Island, the concerns 50 years later that the veterans themselves, were damaged from a chromosomal point of view. That's a legacy that's from a systemic point of view that's passed on to children. But more particularly, what's really been the invisible aspect also is that the wives and partners experience multiple miscarriages, and their stories have never really been told. So I think my sort of question is saying to you, firstly, that I think we have a wonderful Māori psychiatrist in New Zealand called Tom Mason Jury, who has a holistic approach to health and well-being. And basically, he looks at a marae, and he looks at the fact that you have 4 different components that we're looking at: the physical, you're looking at the mental, the social, but the spiritual also. And I think fascinating to me that there's a need, there is so much wisdom in Indigenous people's models of health and well-being, but processes and way of resolving issues, because we're looking within the legal framework of using restorative justice as well, which is a Māori model. And I was just wondering whether we actually went back and looked at Indigenous models, where there is an opportunity to actually reconnect with things that we've lost sight of because of our whole pursuit of technical explorations and scientific achievement. So yeah, observation, but also a challenge and a question. And thank you so much for offering this opportunity. It's been wonderful.
Richard, do you mind if I take this question? Is that
No,
okay?
I was going to suggest.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I'll add that in addition to South Africa, New Zealand also gives wonderful statements at the UN. So you're clearly dealing with the right countries or living in the right places. I'll also add a comment. When the World Health Organization defines what health is, it's defined as physical, mental, and social well-being. And we frequently just equate health with physical health, and we talk about cancer rates or birth defects or whatever other things we've discovered radiation can do to human beings. But it is absolutely true that the mental health impacts should always be included.
And spiritual.
Yeah, and spiritual, and social or spirit. You can find it in different ways. Culture, impact on culture, impact on even the sustainable livelihoods and so on. I don't know about the specifics of the New Zealand study. I do know of a number of studies both showing all of these different impacts on atomic veterans, whether in the US, the UK. Specifically, actually, since you're talking about Christmas Island, the Republic of Kiribati really has recently been a leader on these issues. And in fact, with our policy and advocacy coordinator, Christian Ivana, we really work very closely with the ambassador of the permanent representative of Kiribati to the UN, Ambassador Sito. So there's no doubt that the evidence is and it's sort of shocking how strong the evidence for these impacts at different levels of health, how strong the evidence is around the world. So this is not just in the Marshall Islands or in Kazakhstan. There's some places where more studies have been done than others, but wherever, reputable and independent science was in fact done, the evidence comes very strongly for this. The one really nice thing about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is that it doesn't just ban nuclear weapons, but it also has provisions for victim assistance and environmental remediation, specifically for communities affected by use that's defined as Japan, but also testing of nuclear weapons. So that is something that will hopefully be, strengthened and implemented over the coming decade or decades, hopefully sooner rather than later. But that recognition, and I think that recognition of those humanitarian consequences beyond just what happened in Japan has been really, really key to the push for the treaty, as well as having these provisions for helping those affected.
So I think one of the interesting things, sorry, I don't want to take up too much more time, but currently I've been approached to be an expert witness because we are taking the Māori are taking, as Māori veterans, are taking a claim to the Waitangi Tribunal. And basically, I've been in contact with a young researcher in the UK just over the last weekend called George Collett, whose PhD thesis has looked at the fear of exposure and the psychological impacts of those. So I'll just alert you to that. Thank you.
Well, if we can do one more question, that would be great. And then I'm going to put actually my own email in the chat. So please do feel free to send a question, and Richard and I will try to address it after this event.
Richard, before the war started, I went to the OSCE website daily to see the recorded number of truce violations the OSCE were tasked with recording since the 8-year civil war started after the 2014 US coup. There was a 30% increase in Ukrainian government shelling of the Donbass. And with so many sins of historical omission and the US NATO war prescribed war propaganda, that information was not made known to the public. Are you aware of that?
I'm not, Ray. Good to see you also. But it's typical of what I was trying to say, that the state propaganda operations on both sides of a conflict of this sort is so suppressive of relevant information that would complicate the perception of what would happen and prevent the mobilization of a war mentality. So I'm not surprised.
We can only hope, but we only have faith and hope and love is the greatest.
Well, on that note, I like that, Ray.
Yeah.
I like ending on love. I've actually spoken with Cynthia Lazaroff, who's here on the call, about how love has everything to do with nuclear weapons, because they threaten, in the words of David Krieger, everything that we love. So on that note, I'm going to thank Richard most profusely for sharing his amazing insight and wisdom with all of us, and to all of you for coming and listening to us, and for the great questions. I apologize we couldn't get to all of them, but thank you everyone so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Ivana.
you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.